Sarah's hands trembled as she held the coffee cup, watching through the cafe window as the moving truck pulled up across the street. She had known this day would come, had seen the sold sign go up on the old Henderson house 3 weeks ago, but nothing could have prepared her for the moment when the truck door opened and Jake Henderson stepped out, looking exactly as she remembered him, except for one devastating detail, the gold wedding band that caught the autumn sunlight as he reached back to help his wife down from the passenger seat. 23 years. Sarah had waited 23 years, and he had come back married. The coffee turned bitter in her mouth as memories flooded back with such force that she had to grip the table to steady herself. She was 16 again, sitting in the back row of Mr. Peterson's history class, stealing glances at the boy with the messy brown hair and the crooked smile who had transferred to their small-town high school in the middle of sophomore year. Jake had been different from the other boys, quieter, more thoughtful, with a way of looking at the world that made even ordinary things seem interesting. He read books during lunch, sketched in the margins of his notebooks, and once stayed after school for 2 hours, helping her understand the French Revolution, because he could see she was struggling and didn't want her to fail. That was the day Sarah knew she loved him, though she would never find the courage to say the words out loud. If you believe in the kind of love that endures decades, in the courage it takes to face your past, and in second chances even when they come in unexpected forms, please take a moment to like this video. Comment below with a story of someone you never forgot. Share this with anyone who understands the ache of unspoken feelings. And subscribe to our channel for more stories that touch the deepest parts of the human heart. Sarah had been invisible to Jake in all the ways that mattered. They were friends. Certainly, study partners, lunch companions on days when his usual crowd was absent, confidants in the way that teenagers can be when they're both outsiders in their own ways. But while Sarah's heart raced every time he smiled at her, while she memorized the sound of his laugh and the way his eyes crinkled when he was concentrating on something difficult, Jake saw only a friend. He talked to her about his family troubles, about his father's job that kept moving them from town to town, about his dreams of becoming an architect and designing buildings that would make people feel something. He even talked to her about girls he liked, never noticing the way her smile became forced, the way she changed the subject as quickly as she could. Then, at the end of their junior year, Jake's father got transferred again. It happened suddenly, the way it always did with his family. One week Jake was there talking about which colleges he wanted to visit over the summer, and the next week he was standing in the school parking lot on the last day of classes, loading boxes into the back of his family's car. Sarah had gone to say goodbye, her heart in her throat, wondering if this was finally the moment she would find the courage to tell him how she felt. She had rehearsed the words 100 times. I love you, I've always loved you. Please don't leave without knowing that someone sees you, really sees you, the way I do. But when she got there, Jake was laughing with Christina Morrison, the beautiful blonde from the drama club, and Sarah's courage evaporated like morning dew. She stood there for 10 minutes, waiting for a moment that never came, and then Jake's father called that it was time to go. Jake had hugged her briefly, casually, the way you might hug any friend you're leaving behind, and said he'd keep in touch. He never did. Sarah received one postcard 2 months later from somewhere in Oregon, a generic message about how different the coast was from their landlocked town. And then silence. In the years before social media became ubiquitous, losing touch meant really losing someone, and Sarah lost Jake completely, but she never forgot him. Through 4 years of college where she studied to become a veterinarian because she loved animals the way Jake had loved architecture, with a passion that made sense of the world. Through 3 relationships that never quite worked because she found herself comparing every man to a memory, to a boy who probably didn't remember her name. Through the years of building her practice, buying her small house on Oak Street, becoming an integral part of the community she had never left. Through all of it, Jake remained a constant presence in the back of her mind, a standard against which everything else was measured and found wanting. Sarah had convinced herself she was pathetic. 40 years old, successful in her career, loved by her family and friends, and still carrying a torch for a high school crush who had disappeared more than 2 decades ago. She had tried to move on, really tried. She had dated Mark, the accountant, for 2 years before they both admitted they were going through the motions. She had almost gotten engaged to David, the divorced teacher who loved books and coffee and quiet evenings, but something held her back. Some stubborn part of her heart that refused to settle. Her sister called her a romantic. Her mother called her foolish. Sarah called herself a prisoner of her own emotions, trapped in a past that everyone else had long since moved beyond. And then the Henderson house went up for sale. Sarah had driven past it hundreds of times over the years, watching as other families moved in and out, none of them staying more than a few years. The house had belonged to Jake's grandparents originally, and when they passed away, it had been rented out. Sarah had harbored a secret fantasy that someday Jake would come back to claim it, that he would walk back into her life and somehow, impossibly, see her differently. It was a foolish fantasy, she knew, but fantasies don't require logic. They only require hope. When the sold sign appeared, Sarah's heart had begun to race with possibilities. She told herself not to hope, not to imagine, not to set herself up for disappointment. But late at night, she allowed herself to wonder, what if it was Jake? What if he was coming home? What if, after all these years, fate was giving her a second chance? She played out scenarios in her mind, how they would meet again, how she would be confident and successful, and finally able to tell him how she felt. How maybe, just maybe, he would feel something too. Now, watching Jake help his wife, a petite woman with auburn hair and a warm smile, start unloading boxes, Sarah felt the weight of her own delusion crushing down on her. What had she expected? That Jake had spent the last 23 years pining for the shy girl from his history class? That he had somehow known about feelings she had never expressed? That the universe owed her something just because she had been too afraid to take a risk when she had the chance? She forced herself to look away, to focus on finishing her coffee and getting back to her clinic, where Mrs. Patterson's cat needed a follow-up exam and that Thompson's new puppy needed his shots. Real life, present life, the life she had actually built instead of the one she had dreamed about. But as she stood to leave, Jake looked up and their eyes met across the street. For a moment, nothing happened. Then recognition dawned on his face, followed by genuine surprise and what looked like delight. He said something to his wife and started across the street toward the cafe, and Sarah's heart began to hammer so hard she thought everyone in the room must be able to hear it. The bell above the door chimed as Jake pushed it open, and suddenly he was right there in front of her, older but unmistakably himself, his eyes the same warm brown she remembered. "Sarah," he said, and his voice was filled with such genuine happiness that it almost broke her. "Sarah Chen, I can't believe it's you, after all these years, and you're still here." His smile was radiant, uncomplicated by any knowledge of the pain his presence caused her. "It's so good to see you." Sarah managed to return his smile, to say the appropriate things about what a coincidence it was, about how strange it was that he was moving back after so long. Jake explained that he had indeed become an architect, that his wife Emma was a landscape designer, and they had decided to leave the chaos of the city and come back to his grandmother's house to start a family, to build a life in a place that still meant community. He talked about his career, about the buildings he had designed, about how he had always remembered this town fondly. He asked about Sarah, and she told him about her veterinary practice, about the life she had built in the place he had left behind. Through it all, Sarah performed a role she had never expected to play, the old friend, happy to reconnect, delighted by his success, genuinely pleased about his return. She met Emma, who was warm and kind and clearly adored her husband. She accepted their invitation to dinner once they got settled, knowing she would go because anything else would reveal too much. And when they finally parted ways, Jake hugged her again, longer this time, and said how much it meant to have a friendly face in town, someone who knew him from before. That night, Sarah sat in her house and cried for the first time in years. Not delicate tears, but great heaving sobs that seemed to come from somewhere deep in her chest, releasing decades of hope and longing and foolish dreaming. She cried for the 16-year-old girl who had been too afraid to speak up. She cried for the 40-year-old woman who had let that fear shape her entire life. She cried for all the time wasted on someone who had never been hers to begin with. And when the tears finally stopped, she felt something she hadn't expected. Relief. The fantasy was over. The waiting was done. For the first time in 23 years, she was forced to face reality without the cushion of maybe someday. The weeks that followed were difficult. Sarah saw Jake and Emma around town frequently, at the grocery store, at the farmer's market, at community events. Each encounter was friendly, pleasant, normal. Jake was building his architecture practice in the nearby city, taking on local projects. Emma was transforming their yard into something beautiful. They were nice people, the kind of neighbors anyone would be lucky to have. And with each interaction, Sarah felt something shifting inside her. Something painful but necessary, like a bone that had been set wrong, finally being broken and reset properly. She started going to therapy, something she probably should have done years ago. Dr. Martinez listened without judgment, as Sarah explained how she had loved someone who never knew it, how she had let that love become an excuse not to fully invest in her own life. "You've been living in the past," Dr. Martinez said gently, "but the past isn't a place you can actually inhabit. It's time to come home to the present." The words were simple, almost trite, but they landed with the force of truth. Sarah had been a ghost in her own life, haunting the edges of what might have been instead of fully living what actually was. If this story has moved you, if you've ever held on to someone you needed to let go, if you understand the courage it takes to finally face the truth and choose to move forward, please like this video and share it with someone who needs to hear this message. Leave a comment telling us about a time when you had to be brave enough to let go of a dream to make room for reality. Your engagement helps us reach others who might need these words today. Slowly, painfully, Sarah began to do the work of letting go. She threw herself into her practice with renewed focus, not as an escape, but as a genuine investment in something that brought her joy. She reconnected with old friends she had neglected, joined a book club, started taking pottery classes on Thursday evenings. She went on dates without comparing every man to a 23-year-old memory. Some of the dates were terrible, some were pleasant, none led to anything serious, but that was okay. She was learning to be present, to be available, to be open to whatever came next instead of waiting for a specific something that would never arrive. And then, 6 months after Jake and Emma moved in, something unexpected happened. Sarah was at the hardware store, buying supplies to build a new cat tower for her clinic's resident mouser, when she quite literally collided with someone coming around the corner with a stack of paint cans. The cans went everywhere, white paint splashing across the floor, and Sarah found herself apologizing profusely to a tall man with kind eyes and paint in his graying hair who was laughing instead of being angry. His name was Thomas. He was Emma's older brother visiting from Seattle, and he was helping them paint the nursery because Emma was pregnant and couldn't handle the fumes. They spent 20 minutes cleaning up the mess together, and somehow in that time, Sarah felt something she hadn't felt in years, genuine interest in someone who was actually there, actually available, actually seeing her. Thomas asked if he could buy her coffee to make up for the paint incident, and Sarah surprised herself by saying yes. Coffee turned into dinner. Dinner turned into a long walk through the park, talking about everything and nothing. Thomas was a marine biologist, divorced, father of a teenage daughter, and visiting for a month to help his sister prepare for the baby. He was nothing like Jake, more reserved, more serious, with a dry sense of humor and a passion for ocean conservation that lit up his face when he talked about it. When Sarah got home that night, she realized something profound. She hadn't thought about Jake once during the entire evening. The revelation should have felt like a loss, but instead it felt like freedom. She had spent so long defining herself by her feelings for someone who didn't return them that she had forgotten what it felt like to simply be interested in someone new, to discover another person without the weight of history and expectation. Over the following weeks, Sarah and Thomas saw each other as often as his visit allowed. They went to the aquarium 2 towns over. They had dinner at her house, where he charmed her elderly cat who usually hated everyone. They talked about their failures and fears, their past relationships and future hopes. Thomas told her about his divorce, about learning to co-parent with someone you no longer loved. Sarah, for the first time in her life, told someone about Jake, about the decades she had spent loving someone who had never known it. Thomas listened without judgment. And when she finished, he simply said that he was glad Jake had come back, because it had led her to finally let go, which had led her to be available when Thomas spilled paint all over her. Before you finish this video, I want to ask you to do something. Comment below with the word forward, just that one word, forward. Comment forward if you believe in moving forward even when it's hard, in choosing the present over the past, in being brave enough to open your heart again. Let's fill this comment section with that word as a reminder that we all have the power to choose what comes next. The month passed too quickly. Thomas had to return to Seattle for his work and his daughter, but he asked Sarah if she would be willing to try long distance to see where this might go. She said yes, not with the desperate certainty of someone grasping at salvation, but with the calm confidence of someone who had finally learned to trust the present moment. They would visit each other. Monthly, they would talk every day, and they would see what happened without forcing it, without making it carry the weight of all her unfulfilled dreams. The night before Thomas left, Jake and Emma hosted a small dinner party to introduce Thomas to some of the locals before he went home. Sarah sat at their table, in the house that had once represented all her hopes, eating food prepared by the woman who had married the man Sarah had loved, sitting next to someone who represented a future she hadn't even known to dream about. And she was happy, genuinely, completely happy. Not because everything had worked out the way she had once wanted, but because it had worked out in a way that was real. As she watched Jake and Emma together, she saw them clearly for the first time, not as the villain and the interloper of her fantasies, but as two people who loved each other, who had built a life together, who were about to become parents. She saw Jake not as the perfect boy she had invented in her memories, but as a real man with his own struggles and joys that had nothing to do with her. And in seeing them clearly, she finally saw herself clearly too. Not as a woman defined by her unrequited love, but as someone who had survived it, learned from it, and emerged ready for something real. When Sarah drove home that night, Thomas's hand warm in hers, she realized that sometimes the greatest love stories are the ones we tell ourselves about letting go. Jake had moved away, taking with him a version of Sarah that needed to be left behind. He had moved back married, forcing her to finally confront the truth she had been avoiding for decades. And in that confrontation, she had found not the ending she had imagined, but something better. The beginning of a life lived fully in the present, with a heart finally open to what was actually possible rather than what had only ever been a dream. The past would always be part of her story, but it was no longer the story itself. Sarah was, finally, blessedly, writing a new chapter, and this time the love was real, returned, and gloriously, terrifyingly present. This time, she was brave enough to claim it.